Okay, everybody, this second video is all about documents, about how to analyze them, about how to use them, about how to use HIP, and about how to connect outside evidence to them. It's going to come in two parts. There'll be a pause in the middle so that you can finish this week's assignment. And so I'm going to walk you through actually how to complete this portion of this week's assignment. So when you are analyzing documents, the first thing to understand is that the documents are there to help support your argument. Um, so when you are approaching the DBQ, the first thing you should always do is read the prompts like you guys did already, and then do a quick once over of the documents if you think it'll help, especially if the prompt itself is not really helping to inspire any thoughts about how to answer it. The documents might help you figure out what your claim should be. So once you get to the point of writing your thesis statement, then go ahead and start analyzing those documents. For each document, you should explain how it could be used to support your claim, or that's what you should be thinking about. Obviously, for this AP exam, it might be a little bit tight to do that with only 45 minutes, but do your best that you can to try and do something like what you're doing today for each of the 5 documents you're given. So in addition to just being able to explain how it supports your claim, you should also provide some sort of sourcing. Again, for documents this time, there are 4 points you can earn, 2 points for just using the documents to support your claim, and 2 points for using the sourcing of at least 2 documents. The other little note I have for you about analyzing the documents is once you've looked through them and you've analyzed them a little bit, feel free to go back to your thesis and adjust it if you need to. Maybe you need to make some more specific language in your thesis that more aligns with the documents and therefore will better organize your essay. So the first document that you have for this week's DBQ is coming from the Constitution, and it's from 1787, which is the first year covered in this week's prompt. And the 3 sections of the Constitution they provided for you all have to do with slavery. You'll oftentimes hear people say that the word slavery is never used in the Constitution. That is 100% true. The word slave is never used, but slavery is mentioned multiple times without necessarily saying it. The first time is here in Article 1, Section 2, which is the 3/5 compromise, the idea that in order to deal with representatives in the states, any slave should be considered 3/5 of a person. So therefore they could be counted partially towards representation. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1 is about the slave trade, and it's talking about how in 1808, that's when the slave trade from outside the United States of America would end. The next part is the Fugitive Slave Act, which actually did exist in the original Constitution. Again, it didn't necessarily call itself the Fugitive Slave Act, but what it alluded to was the idea that anybody who was in service or in labor, and more so we call that slavery, or even the indentured servants at that time, if they ran away, they had to be sent back to their owners. And so this is something to just consider, that everything from document number 1 is pointing out all of the issues of slavery that were brought up from the beginning of our country's existence. And this, again, is the same document you will see right here. Now for the chart that you have to complete for each of the documents, the first one is just asking you, how would you use this document to support your particular thesis? And then over here is the sourcing, so choosing either historical context, intended audience, purpose, or point of view, and explaining how or why it's significant or how it connects again to your thesis. So here I did jot dots, but I do ask that you put it into complete sentences, write it as like a short little sentence or two to explain how this document could be used to support your argument. Please do not say the words, "This document can support my argument by." Just bring up what the document is about. So for me, I would bring up the fact that this is from the Constitutional Convention, that all the way back at the Constitutional Convention, the discussion and debate over slavery was a huge and massive issue, as can be seen in the fact that it was used to consider representation, the fact that the federal government was establishing when and how the slave trade would end, and ultimately allowed for the Fugitive Slave Act to exist from our very beginning as a country. So all of those things are very important to my argument, which again was pointing out the fact that the sectional debates have existed since our Constitution was written. Now, in regards to sourcing, I could sit here and I could go through each one, the historical context. The intended audience of this is obviously everyone in America. The purpose of this document is about, again, the whole document is about establishing a government and rules and regulations for our country. And then the point of view is from the perspective of our founding fathers. Now, all of these things obviously are important, but honestly, the historical context is the one that's going to be the most significant to my particular paper. The intended audience is too widespread for it to be specific to the prompt, which again is about the Civil War. The purpose and the point of view, the same thing. I could write an entire book about the points of view of the founding fathers. I would have to write books about that, but it doesn't have a lot to do necessarily with the purpose of the prompt, which is how did sectionalism lead to, or did sectionalism, or to what extent did sectionalism lead to the Civil War? And even the purpose, again, because we're talking about the entirety of the Constitution, it's a little hard to focus on that. Ultimately, that's why I feel the historical context is the strongest point to focus on. So for historical context, I could say something to the effect of, at the Constitutional Convention, intense debate erupted each time the issue of slavery came up, yet the compromises reached failed to truly address or solve the issues regarding slavery, leaving it for future generations to repeatedly debate. So this is what you were doing for each of the other 5 documents. Take a few moments to complete the rest of the documents, pause this video here, and then decide if you want to come back. Because to be honest with you, the rest of the video is going to go into more detail about how you use the information you are currently taking note of in an actual DBQ. So you do not have to do anything from the rest of this video on this week's assignment, but rather it is just showing you how to use HIP in your actual paragraphs of the DBQ. So please come on back if you would like to. Otherwise, pause here and go ahead and finish this week's assignment. Okay, for the rest of this video, we are going to take a look at how do you include HIP analysis into an actual paragraph. And then again, also paying attention to that outside evidence. So again, understanding the HIP analysis for this year's DBQ AP exam, you can earn 1 point by explaining the sourcing or the HIP of at least one of the documents, being able to explain how it is relevant to your argument or supports your thesis. So again, it's not just saying this is the historical context or the audience or the purpose or the point of view of the document, but actually taking the time to connect it to the support of your thesis. And in reality, this is something you should be doing anyway whenever you use a document in your writing. It's actually something you probably already do in your English classes when you do use like an excerpt or a quote from a book. It's the part where you add sort of the commentary in. It's just the historical version of commentary. You actually have up to 2 points for this. Again, you get 1 point for doing it for one document. You get 2 points for doing it for 2 documents. And as I said, you should try and do it for at least 3 in case you don't get one right. So we're going to start by looking at document number 4. This is John Henry Hammond's speech before Congress in 1858. So we're really close to the Civil War now. And if you haven't read this document, just a quick gist of it, John Henry Hammond is a Southerner. And he is actually pointing out that slavery is actually better than living in the North as a laborer. And he's actually pointing out that there's way more starvation, and and that workers in factories are taken care of even less than the slaves are in the South. So it is an interesting approach to defending slavery, but nonetheless, he gave it before Congress. So this again is my thesis statement. Although some historians mark the Mexican-American War and the ensuing debates about the expansion of slavery as the turning point in the path to the Civil War, sectional tensions and disagreements over states' rights, economic policy, and especially slavery dated back to the Constitution and had been growing to the point of disunion for decades before the Civil War. The reoccurrence of these sectional issues and the inability to solve them for decades ultimately led to disunion and the Civil War. So again, I really want to point out anything about economic policy. I want to point out anything about the debates over slavery, the issues of the Constitution and slavery, the issue of states' rights. In this case, I've given you a sample paragraph here about how I could use document number 4. So throughout the 19th century, especially after the First Industrial Revolution, the North and South developed unique economies that contributed to sectional tensions. So a good topic or transition sentence into this paragraph. The North increasingly industrialized, developing manufacturing centers, while the South, especially with the advent of the cotton gin, increasingly relied on large-scale cash crop agriculture, usually cotton, driven by slave labor. These different economies increased the debate over labor systems, with Northerners arguing that free wage labor was superior to slavery. Southern slave owners vehemently opposed this point of view, as seen in John Hammond's Mudsill Theory speech, Document 4. Hammonds and other Southerners attempted to justify slavery by arguing that it actually benefited slaves and was superior to Northern wage labor, which many Southerners asserted was worse than slavery. Thus, even economic differences between North and South ultimately boiled down to debates about slavery, with Southerners becoming more entrenched in the need to justify slavery as it became increasingly profitable with new technologies and trade networks that originated in the First Industrial Revolution, and as more abolitionists and Northerners challenged the economic necessity and viability of slavery. So what I've done here is I've included document 4 up here. A few things to notice is I didn't quote anything from the document, and I didn't name it Doc 4 as seen in Doc 4. Instead, I pointed to the author himself. This is just good writing. You should stay away from saying in document 4 and document 1 and document 2, and actually use the title of the document. Now, I just happen to know the name of this particular speech. That's why I gave it here. If you didn't know it, you could just say as seen in John Hammond's speech. But you will notice I do mention Doc 4. And again, this is just good notes for whenever you're taking any AP exam where you have to use a certain number of documents. By mentioning it here at the end, the reader can sort of check it off as they are grading me. So it just helps really draw attention to the fact that I'm using a document here. But I'm still getting points for being a good writer in the sense that I'm using the author's name. So here, this first sentence of it, I'm talking about what the document is saying. And then down at the bottom, I am getting into how its existence within the historical context of the First Industrial Revolution and the challenges of the Northerners ultimately led to the need for this kind of a debate that was getting even more serious as we got closer to the Civil War. So again, just a quick recap. You want to try and use all of the documents if you can. Even if you aren't completely sure about one, it's always good to try and use all of them because you have to use at least 4 in order to get the 2 full points for using the documents. And so that way, if you end up messing up on one, again, you always have that backup. You need to make sure you connect each document to your thesis and explain how it relates to your argument. You do get 1 point for just using 2 of the documents and relating it to the topic of the prompt, but you get that second point by making sure at least 4 of those documents are supporting your argument. And then finally, do not, under any circumstance, quote the documents. Paraphrase, summarize to show you are using them to make your own argument, but do not quote. Okay. The last little thing here is about how do we use outside evidence. Again, you can earn up to 2 points for outside evidence this time. If you use 2 pieces, you get 2 points. If you use 1 point, or if you use it 1 time, you get 1 point. But always try using it as much as possible. It's always good to attach at least 1 piece of outside evidence in every body paragraph, but it is also worthwhile trying to connect a piece of outside evidence to each of your documents, because oftentimes it is related to your documents. So outside evidence, again, is information not found in the document itself, but might help you better understand what the document is talking about. So you have to use it to support your thesis or make an argument. You can't just randomly, name drop somebody or something. And always try and be as specific as possible. You don't want to just say something like New Deal jobs. You want to actually name what jobs. And the fact that this test this year is open note should hopefully make that a little bit easier. So we're going to try that here with document number 3. Document number 3 was the Free Soil Party platform, which was created in 1848 after the end of the Mexican-American War. So here, if you don't know, if you've never read the Free Soil Party platform, they were not interested in forcing more government control of things. That's where the first statement comes in. But they do believe that slavery should not exist and that ultimately Any place the government does have constitutional power, they should legislate on that subject. So, for example, in open territories, like everything that was won during the Mexican-American War, none of those were states yet. So, technically, in their eyes, the federal government could say that slavery could not exist there. So, how do we use that in our body paragraphs? And how do we also then bring in outside information? So this time the green is going to be the information about the document as well as part of the sourcing. And then the orange is what's going to actually provide us with the outside information. In this case, I'm going to bring up the Missouri Compromise because, again, the Missouri Compromise was a federal government example of them stepping in and saying slavery could exist in some place and not somewhere else. Which is similar to what the Free Soilers are sort of alluding to. So the debate surrounding the spread of slavery and the aftermath of the Mexican-American War immediately gave rise to a new political party, the Free Soil Party, opposed to the expansion of slavery. By opposing just the expansion of slavery, the Free Soilers appealed to both abolitionists and moderate Whigs and some Northern Democrats, contributing to the future realignment of political parties in 1854. So what I've done here is I focus now on the intended audience. And the rise of the Republican Party, whose nomination and election of Abraham Lincoln would be a final event in the road to succession. So by pointing out these are the people who would be the audience, the abolitionists, the moderate Whigs, and some Northern Democrats, and I connect that to the idea that the Republican Party and Lincoln's election ultimately led to the secession of the South, that's pointing to the debate and this sectionalism ultimately leading to the Civil War. So while the Free Soilers formed out of the debates over slavery after the Mexican-American War, this did not represent the first political division over the question of slavery's expansion. The roots of the Free Soilers can be traced back to the 1820 Missouri Compromise, when the admission of Missouri as a slave state threatened to upset the political balance of power between North and South. Similar to the Mexican-American War, this issue divided political parties in a time when there was supposed to be an era of good feelings in politics, showing the national divisiveness of slavery, even within one party, and foreshadowing the future realignments of Whigs and Democrats in the 1850s. In addition, just as the Missouri issue was temporarily put to bed with a compromise, the question of new territories and states from the Mexican cession would require another compromise that did not truly end the issue of slavery, but that instead kicked the can down the road and left the door open for continuing conflict over the spread of slavery. So as you can see, I didn't just drop off my random fact, my outside evidence. I explained what it was, and I connected it to what was happening with this particular document. This document was happening after this particular issue happened, the Louisiana Purchase, the 1820 Missouri Compromise. The Free Soil Party platform is coming after another expansion of America and another compromise. And I'm pointing out that, again, in both cases, it's about the divisiveness that's created. So really trying to prove my point that, again, that divisiveness had always existed in our country, and it wasn't something new just due to expansion. And the last example I'll give you here is with Abraham Lincoln. His speech here is all about sort of the fact that the issue of slavery is everywhere, that it's not something that we can really just get rid of, that it's literally showing up in religion and literature, in politics. Everything is now seeing the debate over slavery existing. So again, the green is how I'm using the document. The orange is pointing out outside information that can help support this as well. So when Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas ran against one another for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858, the two agreed to a series of debates, at the center of which was the issue of slavery. In the debate at Alton, Illinois, Lincoln explained how the issue of slavery transcended politics and divided American society as a whole. So again, I'm just putting document 5. I've alluded to what document I'm talking about without having to say according to document 5. Just 2 years before his election would divide the nation, Lincoln asserted that the issue of slavery was not an issue that was simply exacerbated by politicians, but that it was one that subsumed everyday life across America. In making this point, Lincoln highlights the fact that political acts such as the Gag Rule, Fugitive Slave Act, and Dred Scott decision, and even national elections were so divisive because for decades, Americans had been faced with this growing question of slavery. Churches divided as some used the Bible to justify slavery, while others, like the Grimke sisters, used religion to promulgate slavery as unchristian and immoral. Abolitionist newspapers like the Liberator and the North Star circulated among blacks and whites, and books like Uncle Tom's Cabin infuriated North and South alike, although for different reasons. These social debates about slavery did not surface in the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, but rather had been part of American life since its descent into a slave society in the nation's early history. So again, it's about blending all of it together. You don't have to do it in parts. You can connect it all together. So my outside information is really laying out some of the historical context of this debate that was happening. I also point out the fact that it's just 2 years before his election, which again is the historical context of this particular document, which is important to pay attention to in the sense that by the time we get to those 2 years before he's elected, we are seeing widespread long-term division in our country. So keep practicing interweaving HIP analysis and document use and outside info. If you can, make connections between time periods or address a contrary argument for complexity. And use HIP as many documents as you can in your papers. And make sure you always, always, always connect everything to your thesis. So I'm going to stop here. And if you'd like to keep watching, there will be a third video for our complexity point.